So under the theme, who is the subject of integration, we have today with us Professor Adrian Febel, whom we really thank for accepting this invitation, and welcome with us today. And thank you for being here to kind of share your perspective about the concept of integration, which is a concept that is kind of relevant to all of us, although we work from different disciplines, but it's still relevant to our research. So Professor Adrian, you wrote extensively about the concept of integration. In fact, in your work, you talked about theoretical baggage that underlies it. Can you please briefly tell us how integration, both in theory and in practice, is understood in migration studies?
Yeah, so I suppose in one sense, the focus on integration that I've been thinking about again recently is driven a bit by a surprise. Surprise that integration is still so central, or has over the last few years returned as an absolutely core concept across the board and in all kinds of contexts. Because I was working on integration, the concept of integration in a West European context in the 1990s, doing my PhD, and as you can imagine, it grew very much out of a focus on France and on the notion of intégration in a French context, where it's a more natural kind of concept in a way, linked to immigration. But and I wrote a book called Philosophies of Integration. It was published it was my PhD, published in 1998, which was a comparison of discussions of integration in Britain and France, noting, first of all, the way in which intégration in the French version is very linked to classical ideas of citizenship, whereas in Britain it was used initially in the 1960s as a kind of forerunner for discussions on multiculturalism, after which it became very discredited, really, in the 1970s and 80s as a result of a lot of critical Black writing and anti-racist politics. Really kind of pushed notions of integration to the margin, and it only came back in Britain really during the New Labour period, with a new focus again on integration in relation to usually in relation to questions of Islam and sorts of issues of radicalization or questions of cultural diversity. At a time also when it was rising back onto the agenda everywhere in Europe, so that it has become a kind of central dominant policy term. So I'm very much interested in that kind of the historiography of integration in some ways as a concept in a European context. And as you'll also know and realize, having looked at some of the things I'm writing, particularly recently, I'm also very critical of it. I mean, I'm critical of the kinds of things that are smuggled into the term in a sense, which I think we need to question from a decolonial or critical anti-racist type of point of view. So that's where I'm coming from. But it is work fundamentally embedded, I think, initially in the kind of West European context, if you like. Maybe I can just add one other dimension to that, as is also apparent in the recent thing I've written for a book on migration concepts about integration. There's also this other use of the word, or this other influence, which came in via Britain into the European context, which is integration in a context of Black and white relations in the US. So it's a word that's very much linked to civil rights in the US, and in that context is opposed to the idea of segregation. So there is this kind of aspect of racial equality as also in a kind of traditional liberal civil rights type of sense, which you can also trace, and which is, I think, the influence that comes into the UK and kind of gets mixed up. It's all the issues of race, culture, and social cohesion, and all these things are all mixed up, of course, in this term, and that's kind of what we need to sort out when we discuss it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you for setting out the context of your personal, professional, and intellectual journey into the world of integration. It would be good maybe to follow this question by asking you as well. In your recent conversation with Paul Statham of the SCMRS Talking Heads series, you talked about exactly the historical background you provide. You talked about the historical development in the philosophies of integration, and showed that the term emerged first in the US from the ideals of civil rights, and later adopted in the UK as a way of talking about the emergence of post-colonial society, and the new reflections in France again about the Republican ideals of integration as a kind of civil philosophy of a universalist idea of citizenship. So again, in light of this, where would we situate integration in the history of global colonialism, Western hegemonic epistemology, Enlightenment thoughts, Christianization, colonial education, and the civilizing mission that represent the colonial subjects, the other terms, as receivers of this civilizing mission, salvationist mission, and in many cases in negative terms? Where do we situate the historical, philosophical, and intellectual roots of the concept of integration?
Well, I mean, we obviously want to stress that integration presents itself as a progressive term, and it's a progressive term in that long-term modernist Enlightenment kind of way, as are other terms like citizenship and democracy and freedom, and they're all words that denote some of the ideals, as it were, of modernist development, and self-conceptions of liberal democracies as enlightened societies that are able to deal with political issues and produce progressive outcomes in some sense. So integration obviously it's in that kind of register, and that's obviously where a lot of critical thought wants to focus its scrutiny in some ways, because it wants to question both the reality of these things, the reality of whether integration is actually achieved. So whether we talk about freedom, we talk about citizenship, we talk about democracy, we talk about integration. Are we achieving it in reality? That's a kind of empirical question in a sense. But also, as you all know, in any kind of theory that is critiquing ideas of modernity and modernization, we also believe that sometimes the concepts themselves smuggle in with them implications that can also, the concepts themselves in some sense produce some of the negative effects, or they either they set up standards that are impossible, which therefore discriminate or distinguish between categories and classes of people, or in some cases, they are even kind of instruments of a kind of oppression or a disciplining of words. And this, of course, is the kind of thinking then that's influenced by either a Marxist type of way of looking at things, or increasingly, I think, in recent decades, a more Foucauldian type of way of thinking about the critique of Enlightenment, as it were. So, I mean, that's a kind of philosophical answer to begin with, but maybe helps then situate what I'm going to say. Integration, I think, I suppose one of the things that it was really interesting to find looking, this is something that I only discovered quite recently, but which I, certainly would now use as a way of introducing this topic. This scene at the beginning of the Battle of Algiers, the famous Pontecorvo film, which is of course an iconic film of decolonial critique about the revolutionary struggle in Algeria. The very first scene in which they're torturing an Algerian man, you have a soldier shoving a hat on the Algerian man and saying "intégration" in a kind of laughing kind of way, and that is a sort of parody in a sense of what integration means in the colonial context. It is of course the idea that you are modernizing the colonial native population, as it were, to become like modern Western individuals, and in this case, they're dressing up an Algerian man as a French soldier in order that he can be taken to reveal the whereabouts of the resistance fighters. So there's a strong sense there, I think, of how integration from a colonial point of view means turning the native populations into something like Westerners, that is creating individuals, creating modernized, developed individuals that take them out of their traditional cultures, or lift them out of poverty, or lift them out of backwardness, or whatever the development kind of model is, and producing some sort of modernized individual who will blend into, I guess, the whatever the society is wanting, and I think that's that obviously therefore means that integration is a core concept in modern development theory, and it is about the modernization, the individualization and westernization of non-Western cultures. So for me, it's fundamental. It's fundamental to development models and to modernization theory, and therefore at the center of what we might want to be critiquing when we think about the dangers and damage that has been done with developmental thinking, that imposes all kinds of Western concepts inappropriately, or all the sorts of things that we know follow from that particular kind of othering or Orientalism, or distinguishing between development and undevelopment, or distinguishing between the civilized and the uncivilized, or the the modernized and the barbaric, etc. I mean, all of the things that we know are problematic from decolonial thinking. So that, I mean, that hopefully that fills in a little bit. Maybe there's a kind of philosophical background there, and there's also a direct link, I think, to kind of critiquing the kinds of paradigms of developmental thinking, which are at the heart of all colonialisms, really.
Thank you. Maybe I wonder if we could touch on your observation, your seminar work on integration in the UK and France, for example. If there is a colonial and historical distinction in terms of how conceptually, but in practice, the integration debates and the discourses on integration in a more local Western context are, for example, operationalized. Do you see then there is a historical disconnect between how integration is discussed and debated here versus how integration in colonial, in imperial terms was conceptualized?
So the key point then, I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, certainly, outside of the French language context, I think we'd have to look fairly carefully at whether the word integration was used, for example, in British colonial context. I don't think it was. I mean, I think other sorts of concepts are being used, but referring effectively to the same thing. I mean, it's the same sort of notion of development or modernization, or bringing freedom to the peoples of the world, or whatever, within a British civilization framework. I think what's really important, though, about integration, how it works in terms of its use in the post-war period and in recent decades, is that it denotes this attempt by European nation states to internalize the diversity that was a consequence of the fact that they had global empires, and that the idea of nationhood in an empire context was not a territorial nation. It was something that was a civilizational idea. It was something that spanned the world, and being British or being French was being part of a civilizational a kind of civilizational view of the world that wasn't bounded in that sense. In the post-war period, the British and French civilizations have had to shrink back into territories that then define themselves as nation states in the classic territorial sense of the world, and which therefore the kind of integration that was imagined as a kind of modernization of subjects, for example, within the British Empire, has to now be internalized as a kind of integration of these individuals as members and citizens of a nation state within a particular territorial constraint, and that is the production of British citizenship and French citizenship as integration, and as a way of dealing with the kind of implications of of empire and colonial rule in terms of diversity, I think. So it becomes a crucial mechanism for the production of the nation state in the post-war, post-colonial era. Integration in a way is what integration tries to do is resist in some sense a transformation of that nation state into a kind of into a truly post-colonial and potentially globalized or post-national kind of version of the nation. It tries to resist that, and rather it tries to reconcile the diversity of the world with the specificities of a nationhood that continues to express the highest kind of self-belief of the particular national civilization. So the point about integration in Britain or France is that it is a civilizational idea. It is an idea of British, literally, Britain as the best thing about British nationhood is the fact that it is able to integrate diversity and create British citizens who are part of a nation, but with all the diversity that they bring from wherever they happen to have come from. In the same way, in France, to be a citoyen in France is not to be any particular kind of ethno-cultural identity. It means literally to be an idealized, abstract, individual, modern French citizen. And that is part of a particular kind of nation, and that expresses the, as it were, superior political culture of France, or in the case of Britain, the superior British political culture and their unique ability to integrate diversity in the world. And as you may also know, as you may kind of hear in the way I'm putting this, what makes this definitively an example of European nationalism and the ongoing expression of colonialism is the fact that these countries believe that they are the greatest cultures in the world because of this. The French idea of citoyenneté is the purest and most highest expression, if you like, of the Enlightenment ideal. And that's why it's nationalism. I mean, because that's the definition of nationalism, is that you believe your culture is better than all the others, basically. And you believe that you belong in that culture and others don't belong in that culture because you're part of it. So, and that produces, of course, then all of the the fact that they believe, Britain is the highest civilization for if you happen to be a British citizen. But of course, in order for there to be British citizens, you have to exclude the rest of the world. So you have to also therefore say that anybody that's not British is not part of that civilization in some ways. And therefore, we have the distinction between citizens and foreigners and so forth, driven by this.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ren. Thank you for linking the term, the concept is sort of with nationalism and this localization and forced inclusion of some group of people in another. And in some of your work, you also raise a question that says integration into what? We think mainstream framing of integration is based on several assumptions. First, it assumes that there is one imagined thing to integrate into. Second, it assumes the integration is a mere subscription into some form of assumed homogeneity. And lastly, it also assumes that no emergent reality is created as a result of this integration. If so, are we not risking a complete loss of subjectivity of the incoming population in that context?
Yeah. So this, I mean, this really gets us into the details and the difficulties of understanding, you know, how integration works and what it does, you know, what it does as a kind of way of conceiving of how society works. What I've been talking about so far is how integration enables nations to distinguish themselves from the world, and also draw it enables them to create boundaries in a certain sense. And this is why you know, it's intimately linked to the way in which immigration politics work and how the border works, as well as how the internal process of producing citizens works. The integration into what question is, I mean, partly it's just pointing to the fact that the what part is often not very clearly specified. I mean, it's often I mean, often a lot of work on integration, in fact, is technical work that is kind of talking about integration into the labor market, or integration into the education system, or integration into some sorts of measurements of socioeconomic attainment and so on. So it often doesn't spell out the fact that it is always integration into some sort of bounded entity in a way. And although one can conceive of integration at all kinds of scales, once we get into the details of trying to talk about who a particular new group or minority group that's been somehow categorized as needing integration or going through an integration process, once we start trying to specify who or what they're integrating into, it emerges that the population that we're talking about is inevitably some sort of native population. And in the West European context, of course, the whole discourse about natives and so on that existed under colonialism kind of gets flipped over into, and now we're talking about the natives being, for example, white British people, or indigenous, a kind of so-called indigenous population like the Français de souche, that is, you know, French of French origin, whatever that means. Something that Jean-Marie Le Pen introduced. So, and that what, so that's the what that they're that minorities or migrant groups or whoever the supposed outsiders are integrating into, that what is often not really very clearly described. I mean, we don't really specify who the integration is being it is really, other than it's a kind of majority group that somehow represents the nation, or is somehow a set of norms that represents more or less successfully or functionally integrated people in the society. So that you can see that there's a huge problem there. Basically, we're talking about integration into a society where we don't really have a clue what the mainstream of that society is. Mainstream is one of the ways in which we talk about the what. I think there is obviously implications about assumptions about homogeneity and that are embedded in this. What I don't say in my work is that homogeneity has to be automatically some sort of ethno-cultural homogeneity. It often is, because we often refer to the majority society in terms that suggest a kind of ethnocultural definition. So white British suggests a certain sort of ethnocultural definition of the majority population. And of course, that is a very crudely homogenizing sort of measure from a sociological point of view, since we know that the white British population is, well, first of all, it's not culturally homogenous anyway. I mean, there are significant cultural differences within even a West European nation on a relatively local scale. It's certainly not homogenous in terms of social class. It's not homogenous in terms of gender. It's not homogenous in terms of values. It's not homogenous in terms of socioeconomic position. We talk about our society, in fact, being incredibly divided and polarized and stratified and conflictual. We have, you know, massive fights between conservatives and Tories and Labour or whatever, or young and old people, etc., etc. All of those things are not suggest that the society is not homogenized, and yet we're expecting minorities or migrant groups to integrate into something that we fictionalize as homogenous. You know, I mean, it's also fictionalized as homogenous, obviously, in a historical sense, because we assume in these models generally that before there were minorities, or before there were people of color that were visibly different, or before there were so-called immigrants in our society, the society was homogenous. Usually it's before 1945 in European discussions, which is an absurdity, because before 1945, Britain and France and other European countries were vastly more diverse because they were empires. As kind of, you know, because the nation was not a territorial thing, it was a civilizational thing that included a whole empire of people under a British, you know, under kind of a British flag or whatever. But of course, it was hugely hierarchical. It was hugely racially stratified. There were all kinds of distinctions to be drawn between white Europeans in this and non-white colonials and so forth. But it was inherently very diverse. But somehow in the 1945 period, the creation of a notion of integration and the remaking of the nation state this way has created a false fiction, in some sense, of a pre-existing historical homogeneity, which is of course associated with being white and being British in a British way, or whatever that would mean. And of course, which is why there's been a lot of movement in recent years to sort of, you know, when we see these movies that are about 18th century England or something, you're now more likely to see black and brown faces in these movies, which is likely to be more realistic than, in fact, you know, some of these stories have been in the past, because of slavery, and because, you know, there was even, you know, there was always diversity of some kind under those, you know, under these kind of earlier global conditions. So that's another way in which, you know, that's a way in which homogeneity kind of gets smuggled in as well. You know, we're kind of, with all of these kinds of questions about the integration into what we are, you know, what we have to be doing is really looking very carefully at who, when somebody says, well, we're able to measure integration. Here's a nice model of integration that is intercultural and that is really talking about the progress of a given outsider or newcomer group into the mainstream of our society. So much of the focus in integration is always about how those people are going to change or progress or go through a process or become, you know, develop capabilities, develop abilities that somehow lift them up or level them up with the mainstream society. It's always about looking at how those people are changing. but there's so little focus on the mainstream. There's so little focus on the what part that they're integrating into, which, as I've suggested, is often a simply fictional, homogenized kind of idea. And when it's not that, it's often something that actually is very problematic in another sense, in that often a lot of integration models of this kind are saying, well, these newcomers would be integrated if we could show that they had, strong and close friends networks in their localities where they happen to be living. They're getting to work. They have some sort of employment. They have some sort of income that is at a reasonable level that we can relate to the way in which other people around them are living. This would be a kind of integration. In other words, it might be an integration into a locality where they're living, which will inevitably be in a poorer and less advantaged part of the deeply divided society that we live in, i.e. it might be, this might then be homogenized as a kind of working class thing. So, is it okay if the newcomers are integrated up to a level that is equivalent of a white British working class, for example? That would be, would that be okay? Well, would that be integration? The answer is no, of course it wouldn't. It would be integration into inequality. It would be, in other words, it would be a reproduction of an unintegrated or disintegrated society that has produced a stratified scenario in which working class people are at a disadvantage in relation to other people. And then if we looked at that even closer, we'd start to see, well, actually, we're not even talking about, because the working class itself is a fictional construction in British discussions, because the working class, in fact, is that the people who are really disadvantaged or peripheral or marginalized in our society are not the working class, but are people who are not working, who are unemployed, who are on benefits, who are single mothers, who are living on benefits, etc. And this is often where, of course, where a lot of new migrants and asylum seekers and so on are placed in these kinds of contexts, in fact, amongst other people who are themselves not in any way integrated in society. They are amongst the least integrated people in our society. So you can sort of see that so I mean, I've kind of gone on at length here, but you may have to edit this at some point. But the integration into what question just opens all of these things up, like it's like a Pandora's box once you start looking into what the mainstream or what the majority society really is, because we simply, in most migration and immigration research, we simply pay no focus on the majority. We just simply look at minorities and look at all the differences that they have, and all of the ways in which they are failing or succeeding to integrate, etc., without looking at why the majority society is not, in fact, in no particular example of present day liberal democracy or capitalist society do we have an integrated majority. There's no such thing really in a world in which we have such deep inequalities, and that's even within societies that are relatively equal. When we then start thinking about inequality on a global level, you open up a whole other set of deeply problematic questions about what integration might mean, and which I think you maybe want to get to in some of the other questions. But
thank you.
Do offer me some guidance, or jump in if you have things that you think I should be explaining better or want to hear more about.
Yeah, so it's good. It just if I don't know if Iyad was asked that. So in terms of the new emergent social ecology, for example, is what would you say about that? Would you touch on that, for example, when you talk about integration, just as a unidirectional journey of a group of people, for example?
Yeah, I can just add to that question. Yeah. What's the impact of this incoming population in the host societies?
Yeah.
Should we frame the question integration into what, or integration of what, or with what?
Yeah.
Are there equal subjectivities integrating into?
So you wanted to ask something as well, or?
Yeah. Well, my question, it's not, it's a bit divergent from the migration study, but as you were speaking about the progressive connotations and the thinking about modernism, which also the word integration carries, I couldn't help but to think about the Algerian context as well, and how sometimes reforms in higher education, they are kind of justified pour pouvoir s'intégrer au monde, pour pouvoir s'intégrer au système d'éducation international. And this use of integration in the context of, for example, higher education or education, system of education, do we have also to question what is meant by integration in here, as the word itself it's contested?
Let me take that one first, and then I'll come back to the ones that Hiyab and Tesfalem have been asking. Because I think, yeah, this use of the word in French, what it's signaling, I think, is something that is very, very much about the core idea of modernization theory, which is the production of the modern individual, right? And this is why I trace it back to Durkheim always in the things that I write, because and integration fundamentally is a Durkheimian concept. So this is, a French classic invention of the high period, if you like, of French modernization in the late 19th century, post-revolution, in which the emergence of a modern functional society produces free individuals. It produces citoyens, literally. And in order to be a citoyen, you have to be fully capable as a citoyen. You have to be fully educated through the system, through your socialization, through your educational progress, and through your participation in various social institutions. You learn how to become an individual. This is the modern individual. Now, the modern individual, obviously, is in a critical sense, is what we are also referring to when we refer to things like whiteness, right? So, these ideas about the modern individual being emancipated somehow and becoming this completely self-possessive, autonomous creature that's able to think for themselves and create the world as around them in their own image, as it were, is of course the high ideal of the Western Enlightenment. It goes all the way back to Immanuel Kant and philosophical ideas about what a modern free individual should be able to do. And so, of course, and the continued insistence upon this kind of ideal is always expressed so I think whenever you see the word intégration, it's kind of evoking that sort of idea, even in a very practical educational document. I think it's now, and of course, because we think critically, because we've taken on board the critics of the Enlightenment that have been around for centuries and that have continued through into contemporary critical race type versions of these critiques, such as Frantz Fanon or something. We know that this idea of the modern white Western citizen individual also creates other, it's always got an othering in it. There's always a something that is non-human or defective human that is out there defining what is human and so forth. And that's where, all of the critiques then from a race, critical race point of view or a decolonial point of view come in. So I really don't think, what I find mystifying is that people who are perfectly able to understand the critical position here and the critical philosophical position will then turn around and start using integration in some other way that they think is somehow not subject to the same criticism, because at the end of the day, that's what integration means. It means this kind of classical enlightened idea of the modern individual, in some sense, being emancipated. It's an emancipatory type of discourse, and we should know by now that emancipatory discourses are problematic, always. It's not to say that it's not philosophically possible to talk about this. That's another question, I think, but but in historical and empirical terms, this language has been used to oppress people and distinguish between the West and the rest, and distinguish between civilization and barbaric, and so forth and so forth and so on. So you know, that's again, I think there are always philosophical things riding on integration and these kinds of implications. Now, if I come back to the question about that Hiab is asking, I mean, I think both of you probably are, you know, you're wanting to ask me the question in some sense, well, okay, but aren't you exaggerating? You know, maybe we could redefine integration as in a more practical and more sympathetic way that would be closer to the way in which people that do intercultural research maybe think, which is that you know, we can just simply redefine integration. Let's get rid of all of this Durkheimian and Kantian and kind of modernization theory baggage that you're saying it comes with, and we'll just focus on the practical issue of interactions between newcomers and existing populations, and we'll try and look at the ways in which those interactions take place in order to you know, build a better society in some sense, or build better relations between people on maybe on a local level, and we can kind of come up then with various sorts of typologies and models of an intercultural integration, perhaps that works in this sort of way. Now, you know, my general position is that I still think all of that is subject to what I've been saying previously. I mean, in some sense, I still think it's very much subject to the integration into what type problem. I think when we look more closely at it, we will be talking about integration into something that is actually, even if we don't really admit it openly, is a national society. It's something that that has a kind of coherence at a national sort of level. It's not possible, it's really not possible to talk about integration only from the point of view of whether or not the migrant person or the newcomer, I'm, you know, hesitant always around the categories, I'm sorry, but it's not about how they're feeling, for example. Just because somebody feels integrated doesn't mean they're integrated. Just because they are personally achieving things doesn't mean they're integrated either, because it's not the property of the individual, it's a property of the system. And you know, you can be integrated because you measure up you know, you have a neighbor and you're in some sort of locality in, you know, an inner city area in a city, and you're integrated in the same way that your neighbor is integrated. It's not integration if you in fact both are highly disadvantaged relative to some other people in the same society who have all kinds of elite privileges because they're rich and educated and powerful or whatever. You know, we have to sort of say what the system is that people are being integrated into, and we don't live in an integrated society. So, but I do think that under the cover of talking about integration, we could be talking about very interesting interactions, intercultural. It's not that intercultural interaction doesn't happen, and it's not that there isn't change in the society because of that interaction. That of course happens, but what I'm questioning is whether that is integration. It is not integration because what it often is and has been over past decades, when these kinds of things have happened, in fact, it would be better to think of it as a kind of disintegration. That is, it is a kind of disintegration of the nation state. It's a disintegration of the United Kingdom. Well, let me start with France first of all, because France is a bit easier, because France is a unitary nation. And every time, you know, you have what a nation does in order to be integrated, what a nation has to do is in some sense reduce it has to distinguish itself from the global environment by becoming less diverse than the global environment in some sense. And this is a kind of functional way of thinking about how nations work. And that's really what is going on when the process of turning people into French people is about trying to create a society that is distinct from the rest of the world, which has a greater degree of diversity in some sense. It's a less diverse thing. And in order to do that, it has to impose certain things on people, and that's usually through laws and rules that people have to follow, and there are certain sorts of cultural things that get smuggled in with that, but generally it's about trying to become a kind of functional individual within that sort of society. Now, what happens when in fact diversity comes into that society from the outside is that you get interactions that are going on that are changing the people who are there, so that the majority population is becoming more diversified because it's coming into contact with more diversity, which in fact is actually producing the opposite of what the integrating nation state is trying to do. It's actually producing a disintegration. It's actually making the nation look more like the rest of the world, if you like. It's what I call a de-differentiation of the nation state, and that is what we also call, that is the kind of thing that we refer to when we refer to things like hybridity or cosmopolitanism or transnationalism, or even things like conviviality, I think, are actually referring to a certain sort of disintegrative process from the point of view of the nation state. And the other way in which I think that they are disintegrative in a way is that I think that they also introduce, I think we also have to take seriously the idea that migrants introduce conflict into society, rather than thinking this in consensual terms. That is, people, newcomers, everything's fine as long as everybody's getting along and happy. Well, no, what happens when people get along and they're happy is that they get, they basically assent to, they're accepting their position in society. They're not, they're being offered something and they're saying, well, you can join our society, but we're giving you, you're going to be at the margins of the lowest end of the working class or whatever. And people accept that as a good thing because maybe in relation to where they've come from, it's a good thing. But that naturally reproduces the inequalities at the national level. It also has reproduced the international inequalities, which is something we can get to. But I think what would be interesting is the idea that that diversity actually introduces change into society that is kind of conflictual in some sense, that it's disintegrative of the political order in some ways. And that is the case when you have mobilizations, when you have struggles, when you have people who engage in talking about migrants' rights or minority rights in an aggressive way that actually challenges the order of things, that it challenges the way in which society is actually ordered and starts campaigning for more equality. And this is just an old point about conflict theories rather than consensus theories, whereas integration, of course, is a consensus theory. It's a theory about consensus building in society. It's about building harmony, cohesion, good relations between people. But actually what we would want to see in society is more conflict. We'd want to see people getting more angry, campaigning for things, changing things and making things better that way. By campaigning for equality or justice, etc. And I do think that's another way in which I think new populations or populations that bring different sorts of aspects of diversity to relatively homogenized societies bring in some ways. They de-differentiate the society, and they also and bring a kind of disintegrative force, which is it's a conceptual thing. I mean, it's trying to think about this disintegration maybe as a kind of positive kind of concept.
Yeah. Thank you. Kharia, do you want to ask any questions?
Thank you, Adrian. So now, so far we talked about integration in the context of, or in relation to migration from the global south to the global north societies. But now we would like to talk about migration instead from the global north to the global south.
Right.
De Sousa Santos, in his book, Epistemologies of the South, Justice Against Epistemicide, he wrote, the inability of global north to learn from the rest of the world emerged from invented white supremacy that underpinned colonialism and imperialism.
Yeah.
So we would like to hear your thoughts on migration from the global north to the global south, and where migrants are often represented in positive terms, such as expats, humanitarian workers, and not being subject to of a great deal of scholarly and policy debates insofar as integration with local communities is concerned. So, on the other hand, migrants from the global south are expected, for instance, to learn the language, the cultures, values of the whole society, and therefore integrate into the mainstream of political community.
And that makes very clear the relations of inequality between the global north and the global south, right? The fact that people moving in one direction, i.e. from the south to the north, are not at liberty to do whatever they want. They have to follow the rules. They have to find ways of connecting with the society, and they have to integrate, even if that feels like a positive process, as I'm saying, a kind of process of consent, of building relations and giving your consent to being a member of that society. You've gone through a certain sort of transformation that has been forced upon you in a certain sort of way, and that is exactly as you're saying, Kharia. This is exactly what a white expat business colonial type person going to Africa or Southeast Asia or whatever does not have to do ever, because they are at liberty to simply be global individuals.
They perform high culture.
So elite this reveals a couple of interesting things. When you think about it through this way. There's some very nice writing about this by Sarah Kuntz, who's working at the University of Bristol. She's been writing about expats in Africa in these terms. And it's a really important point because, so one thing about this is that studying expats and what happens to them in foreign contexts, non-Western contexts, let's say, to keep it kind of in the simplistic terms, is very interesting, because we see that what we might have thought of as integration in a Durkheimian sense when we were looking at these so-called immigrants arriving in France or Britain and having to become French or British, we think that's what integration means, and that reveals how societies are integrated. We realize that in actual fact, in the context of somebody living in Lagos in Nigeria or something as a British expat, they're perfectly comfortable and functional in that society. So in some kind of way they are integrated. They're integrated into something, but they're not integrating into the local national society. There's absolutely no pressure to do so. And if they go out and make friends with some locals, African nationals who are living locally and from the place, they can make friends and they can create new sorts of social relations, and they might even refer to this as integration, but it isn't really integration, because they don't need to belong there. They don't ever become part of it. They never start to assimilate to the positions that these other people are in, both locally and internationally, in terms of their socioeconomic position in the world. They're never equal in that sense. They're always, because they are carrying their privilege, their privileged nationality and often their privileged racial status as expats. And they can't ever lose that, really, because in some sense that's the order of the world that they're kind of stuck in. But they are somehow integrated into something. And you say, well, what are they integrated into? What they're integrated into is global society. So there is a kind of integration going on, but the integration that they're going to is a kind, well, it's not a good integration in the sense that a global society, the privileges of these expats is precisely an index of the degree of stratification of global society, but it is a kind of integrated system. It is a system that functions smoothly and to reproduce these inequalities. And these inequalities, of course, are linked to people's nationalities. Ultimately, and if you can kind of read this in the theoretical articles where I spell this out, this is of course linked to the fact that it is their citizenship, ultimately the nationality that people carry, that determines most strongly where they stand in the global hierarchies that we're talking about here. So it's that's why I think the expat situation is different. I think it's a little bit different, I think, to the Santos point. I mean, the Santos point is a point, a more classic kind of decolonial point about how, colonialism of the West consisted of bringing knowledge systems and ways of thinking to the global South that had smuggled into them, through concepts such as citizenship or integration or freedom or democracy or whatever, notions of white supremacy, that there was this kind of racialized component to these supposedly universal Western concepts that were being applied everywhere, and that nobody bothered to listen to the views of the subordinate parts of the world, because they didn't seem to match up to the universalistic standards that, in some sense, they were abstract standards that were also embedded in notions of modernized technology and modernized social institutions, modernized political systems, and so forth. I mean, that's where it's difficult, because the concepts maybe do still imply something that is different to the very specific Western forms that they took, but historically we're unable to separate these things, because that's how colonialism worked effectively. And of course, somebody like Foucault points out, effectively, systematically shows us how the technologies and the concepts are embedded in one another. But I don't know. I'm more interested in some sense in the empirical question. So the empirical question of what we understand by studying expats, or what we understand by studying people who enjoy freedom of movement under certain conditions, compared to people that don't. So the mobile versus the immobile, and how that reproduces a certain sort of order of nationality that we can measure in terms of the power that certain citizenships give you in the world. Everybody knows that the best citizenship in the world is, well, I don't know what it is nowadays. In fact, technically speaking, which passport is the most valuable, but it's something like a Norwegian passport. But obviously an American passport's a very highly rated one, whereas other passports from other parts of the world are very, very poorly rated, because they don't give you access to anything. And even they don't give you security in your own country, as we know in many cases. So, and that ultimately is what gives the power to expats. But of course, historically, it is also embedded in racial formations and hierarchies, and the legacies of colonialism and so forth that have embedded these things. But I suppose there are, one of the things you'll also see if you look into my works, I'm also interested, rather than just focusing on the dramatic case here of the white European expat in a Black African context, where the inequality is so dramatic. I'm also interested in the relative inequalities that you get, say, within the space of Europe, in relation to freedom of movement in Europe, and whether or not, certain things that, say, on that scale were altered by the fact that, you know, we had European citizenships, for example, which were offering freedom of movement across the continent, and whether or not that gives us any kind of clue about what a global freedom of movement would look like, and how that might, you know, whether that might shift any of these historically inbuilt kind of colonial inequalities that you know, seem to be so inevitable when we talk about the world as a system of organized nation states, effectively, you know, with a hierarchy.
Yeah, thank you. So Ed, you raised a question. Your hand if you want to ask a question.
I think that this is our last question. Is it? Yeah.
Yeah.
You've covered this in a way when you were speaking about the different how the term is being used, and we wanted to kind of raise this question. Sometimes academics are aware of the theoretical baggage that the word or the term integration carries, but they may continue to reproduce the mainstream conceptualization and application of integration in the absence of maybe alternative approaches. Our question is, how do academics, who are often maybe involved in policy making or policy research, balance this inherently problematic nature of integration as a concept or as a practice?
Yeah, and this is a good practical question. It might be almost, you know, the kind of place where you could start the discussion rather than finish it in some ways, because it cuts to the practical issue that we face as researchers, partly because of the ways in which funding opportunities are presented to us, or, you know, there happens to be a fashionable discussion around a particular concept that is also being picked up, and we're kind of obliged to use it because it's just out there in the discourse. And I think a lot of uses of integration are not really talking about integration as I've been describing it, or at least are trying to avoid the kinds of issues that I'm trying to talk about, and that they possibly ought to be using different words, but they don't, because they feel kind of we have to talk about it in terms of integration. So what I'm talking about here is there's a classic kind of issue here, which is about distinguishing between categories of practice and categories of analysis. This basically comes from Pierre Bourdieu's work, but you also see this expressed quite well in some of Rogers Brubaker's writings about ethnicity and identity. And what we've got, of course, with integration, much of the time, in much of this sort of mid-level policy-related research on integration, such as a lot of the research about refugee integration and a lot of the projects that are out there about refugee integration currently, they're using the word integration as a category of practice, but presenting sometimes their work as a category of analysis. In other words, they're blurring the two things. And this is really problematic, I think, for scholars, because we get caught up in words that have blurry meanings, that are also being used by politicians, by policymakers, by the media, and that are not, it's just not clear what, where the line kinds of falls. And I think because we're critically aware of the way in which concepts are embedded in philosophies, and then embedded in, they have epistemological content to them. They imply different sorts of things in relation to a long history of sociological theory and of conceptualization that can be rooted, that can be traced back academically. We cannot pretend that it's simply okay to use a category of practice in that way. So, in the British context, the integration debates are as I said, have arisen again around a very specific use of the word that is related to the problematization of Muslim communities in Britain as being non-integratable, as being imposing backward cultures on women particularly, and as of leading to radicalization. And integration was posed by in the policy research that was done on these kinds of questions in terms of integration. Integration was posed as a solution for these as a kind of problem. They were seen as problems of Muslim communities, and integration involved going in there and getting the young people, or getting the women, and getting the excluding the radicalizing aspects and integrating the things that could fit with Western culture effectively, or with British culture. And this is the kind of that is a dominant policy understanding. If you go talk to people in local authorities or the police force, or people, journalists or anybody else, that's what they think of as integration as meaning. So to try and define integration as something else, you're not really paying attention to how it's being used as a category of practice in a dominant way. And if you want to describe other things, such as positive community relations, or the construction of new kinds of cultural, a new kind of cultural environment where diversity is recognized, or where people can bring all of the things that they have with them from wherever they're related to in the world, or where they can introduce transnational dimensions into local society and these kinds of things. Let's continue to talk about them as multiculturalism, or as interculturalism, or as cosmopolitanism, or transnationalism, or hybridity, or diaspora. All of these words, conviviality, all of those words do not have the same problems that integration does. Integration is the problem here as a concept. And I can see why all of those things, we might want to spin these positive phenomena into something that we then sell as an integration idea or integration policy in order to get the funding. But there is a real problem doing that, and a real cost when you then associating these other things that, as I said, used to be talked about straightforwardly as multiculturalism, and not always multiculturalism. There is a nationalist version of multiculturalism as well, which is which is a kind of integration as nationalist multiculturalism or something, which is promoted by some thinkers. That's not, there is also a recognition that our societies are becoming hybrid and globalized and multicultural and post-national, and where you have diasporic identities and people are hybrid, and things are transforming at the local level in urban environments and so on. We don't need to describe that as integration. We could describe it in these other terms. So that's kind of, a bottom line in some sense. What I'm saying is that we should just be very, very cautious about the problem of blurring categories of practice and categories of analysis. And integration is problematic both as a category of practice and as a category of analysis. And it has some really serious problems when you start looking at it historically, in relation to colonialism, in relation to what it means as a core idea of modernist development, and it has this more sort of systematic weight to it, because it kind of has this, we feel that there's something quite mechanistic about it, or that it gives us this idea of systematic thinking about society, which is actually a kind of way of thinking about national society, in a way that some other terms that are talking about the same thing, such as inclusion or participation or accommodation, or even acculturation, which also has a lot of problems, but those don't quite have the same, even have quite the same baggage, I would say, as integration does. But But yeah, I mean, I sometimes feel a bit of a minority amongst certain, in certain sorts of fields of scholarship, both, in terms of, there's been a lot of policy-related research that has used integration in recent terms, particularly in relation to refugee integration, not just in Britain, but all across Europe. There's also a massive number of, I'm interested also in quantitative research on integration, not just the kind of theoretical debates or typologies, but actually measurable studies of integration. And there's a huge number of quantitative scholars who are doing integration research without ever problematizing the term. And they used to call it assimilation, but now they call it integration. It's basically the same thing. And assimilation as a technical thing, which is a mathematical way of measuring the statistical disappearance of groups into a mainstream of society, which can include diverse groups, but which is statistically homogeneous. And as you're hearing, creating models that pretend that our societies are homogeneous, and have, where there is a kind of benchmark for integration or something that we can say that everything's okay as soon as somebody's reached that benchmark is hugely problematic, because it ends up reproducing the inequalities that get lost in these models effectively. Yeah.
Thank you, Adrian. Every one of us would have liked to spend the rest of the evening with you, and I'm sure every one of us has questions to ask. It has been really stimulating discussion. So we would like to thank you again for making time to sit with us and giving us this really in-depth historical, philosophical, and empirical, conceptual analysis to integration. And your point on this integration to achieve a genuine integration is really very interesting and echoes with some of my observations on my research as well. Sometimes people say, no, politics is not for me. And I'm happy, I'm very content with what I've got. I've got my status. And then the question is, what happens? Can we be politically religious? Can we be politically selfish and angry? Which again is about disintegration. Having a positive, proactive, confident integration. Yeah. So I would like, on behalf of the team, I would like to thank you again. Enjoy the rest of the evening, and hopefully we will see you in similar conversations.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, hope it all works for you, and you can use what we've talked about. So.
It was indeed. Thank you.